Hi, this is Dark Journalist. Today I have a special episode for you. Our guest is the author of the acclaimed Giza Death Star book series, Dr. Joseph Farrell. Together we'll look at the roots of the secret space program right up to the announcement by the Trump administration of the Space Force. Is a covert system of finance and advanced technology behind the wall of secrecy that dominates the national security state? Let's go take a deeper look. Joseph, it's great to have you back with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we're going to go deep into the history of the secret space program, and that's going to bring us right to the period of the JFK presidency and this fascist international that you've documented so well, infiltrating certain aspects of NASA and the aerospace industry.
Right.
Now, last year saw the limited release of some JFK assassination files, but most were held back by the Central Intelligence Agency, even though they were mandated by Congress to release everything. They're actually pushing it off until 2021, when I'm sure they'll find some other excuse. One of the unusual documents we did get was an odd FBI report from this period suggesting that Hitler had survived World War II and was in Colombia in the 50s. Now, taking a cue from some of your work on the Nazi International, the question is, why is this strange document alleging that Hitler is still alive and running around in Colombia, South America, doing among this, treasure trove of classified documents of the JFK assassination?
Right. Yeah, that's an odd thing.
So what's a good answer here?
Well, there's only two things that I can think of that would justify that. Number one, somebody at the FBI or the CIA had an appallingly bad sense of humor and said, oh, let's just slip that document in the tranche of documents that are going to be released just for fun, and see what people do with it.
Right.
Because the file itself doesn't prove anything. It's just a report from a field agent, hearing a rumor and reporting, oh, I heard this rumor that Hitler's alive in Colombia, and you pass it on to headquarters. Mm-hmm. So, the file doesn't prove anything. It's just there, but that's the problem. Why is it there? Yeah. And the other conclusion I came to, well, it's there because the Nazis had something to do with the JFK assassination, which has always been what I've thought. It's what Mae Brussel thought, and in my book, the LBJ and the Conspiracy to Kill Kennedy, I devote a part of the book to that aspect of the assassination that most people don't cover. Mm-hmm. There are reports. I placed a document in my book, The Nazi International, about yet another report that was made to the FBI in the 40s about Hitler being alive and well in South America, that was passed on to the FBI. But that report was so significant that President Truman asked the FBI to investigate it further. And the problem there is, of course, Truman's the one that signed the National Security Act into law. Mm-hmm. And Truman would have known that in terms of espionage and intelligence gathering, the CIA had jurisdiction for all foreign intelligence work. The FBI was to have jurisdiction for all domestic counterintelligence. So in other words, you would think that if Truman was to follow up on Hitler being alive in South America, that he would have turned it over to the CIA, but he doesn't. And the question is why? Yeah. Well, I suspect that Truman suspected by that point, as he later admitted, I've created a monster with this CIA thing. I suspect that Truman suspected that paperclip and all of that and the relationship between the CIA and West German intelligence, General Gehlen, was too strong and too pervasive. In other words, he didn't trust the CIA to do an objective investigation on the Hitler survival story. So who do you turn to? Well, you turn to Hoover, who had a reputation, of course, during the war of hunting down Nazis right and left. Mm-hmm. So it was the logical choice for him to make. So back to JFK. If you look at JFK, the thing that I think people overlook is a symbolic message in the assassination, because when the assassination is first reported, the weapon that they talk about constantly is a 7.65 Mauser. Later, as the news reports are unfolding during the day, you get that changed to the 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano that eventually becomes the official assassination weapon of the narrative. Now stop and think about those two rifles. What's a Mauser? Who's a Mauser associated with? Well, the Germans, okay?
Mm-hmm. Right.
The Mannlicher Carcano is what? It's an Italian carbine rifle. So the two rifles are telling you there's a connection to the Axis powers, okay? Mm-hmm. Dig a little further, and you find out that the 7.65 Mauser was never a caliber that was issued to the German army. Okay, and even during the reporting that day, people are talking, well, this is, the German army rifle. No, it was no such thing. The 7.65 Mauser was a special issue of the weapon that was issued under license to Argentina.
Oh.
So in other words, those little clues are pointing you in that direction. So you dig a little further and you get into the Garrison material, and you find there this weird connection between David Ferry, who's one of the premier people that Garrison fingers. And of course, he plays a major role in Oliver Stone's movie JFK, the character played by Joe Pesci.
Mm-hmm.
And David Ferry, in turn, is connected very weirdly to a New Orleans cancer researcher by the name of Dr. Mary Sherman. This lady that had impeccable academic medical credentials and had been deliberately brought to New Orleans by Dr. Alton Ochsner, mm-hmm. who at that time, of course, was the head of the famous Ochsner Clinic. He was the president of the American Cancer Society, well known internationally throughout the world as a cancer researcher and specialist, But interestingly enough, Dr. Ochsner, in turn, was fingered by many people, especially after the Garrison investigation, for having helped the CIA work on cancer inducement to weaponize cancer. And this is what Garrison suspected in connection with David Ferry.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, you have this triumvirate. David Ferry, Dr. Ochsner, and Dr. Sherman may have been working on some sort of secret project to weaponize cancer. So what's the South America connection? Well, as it turns out, Dr. Ochsner, who incidentally is from my home state of South Dakota.
There we go.
Oh, yeah. I grew up. I remember as a little boy, my parents taking me to the doctor in Sioux Falls, and there on the wall proudly displayed was a picture of Dr. Alton Ochsner.
Oh, wow.
Native boy does well, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And Dr. Ochsner and his clinic had a number of very interesting patients from South America, including, guess who? Our good friend, Generalissimo Juan Perón.
Wow.
Okay. And Ochsner, this is the other very weird thing that I uncovered in my research. Ochsner would occasionally go on these trips to South America, but no one knows what they were for or where he went. So yeah, you got
picking up a little medical technology along the way.
Yeah, picking up a little medical technology along the way. Maybe helping out Dr. Mengele with his little blonde hair, blue eye project there in Brazil. Who knows? Right. And it's interesting because, of course, Dr. Ochsner is German. He's a South Dakota German. I know these people. I grew up with them.
Mm-hmm.
So, he spoke German fluently, did his little tour of Europe, when he was a young man, visiting all these German medical research facilities and writing medical papers in, German for the medical journals. So, yeah, the guy spoke German. So in other words, all the fingers, this is the really bizarre thing. If you start pulling on those New Orleans threads long enough and hard enough, eventually they're going to lead you to South America. So that's one of these very bizarre, weird Nazi connections. So the presence of that Hitler file in the JFK release, this is the context in which it has to be read, and that makes it significant. But there's another connection to this JFK Hitler survival mess, and it's even much more significant than any of the stuff I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And that's the Texas oil men, Murchison and Hunt, a fellow by the name of Paul Regorodsky, all of these people in and around Dallas that are connected with these big Texas oil men, because, of course, JFK had singled out the oil depletion allowance as one of his plans, to raise revenues for the federal government. And thus the Texas oil men hated him. And, oh, by the way, let us just remember who also was in Texas at the time as an oil man, King George I.
Well, that's George Bush.
Yeah, George Bush, exactly. So, this is a very tight-knit community. Well, one of the interesting things, and this was uncovered by Peter Dale Scott. I know you've had him on your show.
Yes, Professor Peter Dale Scott of UC Berkeley, and he coined the term the deep state and has given us some of the best research on these hidden interconnections with these groups.
Right. Professor Scott pointed out the fact, I think it was in Deep Politics and JFK, if I'm not mistaken about the book. He pointed out that the Texas oil men were long suspected of having their own private intelligence network of some sort. Right. Okay, and I had read that in other sources, some sources in France and so on, but Scott traced it down to something very interesting, and when I read it, I was just blown away, because it turns out that their private intelligence network was via some contact with General Galen's organization, with West German intelligence, with the German Bundesnachrichtendienst, okay? And when I read that, I thought, oh, gee, there's a Nazi connection.
Yeah.
Because, of course, Galen was the fellow that ran during World War II the military intelligence unit for the German army called Fremde Heere Ost, which means Foreign Armies East. And Fremde Heere Ost was not just a typical military intelligence unit, it was a network of spies within the Soviet Union, within Eastern Europe, with a lot of ties to these communities that would fight for the Waffen-SS against the Soviets. The Byelorussians, the Latvians, the Estonians, the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, all of these guerrilla stay-behind units that we read about during in the aftermath of the war, the NATO Gladio units. These were Galen's people. Mm-hmm. All of these emigre fronts in this country were connected to Galen. I remember during the Dukakis Bush campaign, a Democratic researcher by the name of Russ Bellant, that was working for Governor Dukakis's campaign, wrote a book called Old Nazis and the New Republicans, or some such thing. I've referred to this book many times in my various researches because it's a very well done book. Of course, it was completely dismissed. Right. But it's a well-done book. And he points out that all of these emigre communities in this country, the White Russians in Dallas and so on and so forth, are connected to Galen's organization, to, German military intelligence, which becomes West German intelligence after the war, right, with Galen running it. So these are who the Texas oil men have their private intelligence network. So the question is, how do we liaise between the Murchisons and the Hunts and General Galen?
Yes.
Because Galen is significant in this whole Kennedy story for one obvious reason, and that's Lee Harvey Oswald. Mm-hmm. Oswald defects to the Soviet Union, and everybody says and thinks, well, he was part of some intelligence operation being run by the CIA. And this is where I get so frustrated with Kennedy assassination researchers, because yes, that's true. But the problem is, who are the human agents and networks on the ground inside of Soviet Russia at the time that are capable of monitoring and running Oswald, and not only getting him into the Soviet Union, but out of it? Well, it ain't the CIA.
Right.
Because the on-the-ground human intelligence is General Galen's network. He is the CIA's on-the-ground intelligence network.
Right. Right.
And this goes back to that deal that was struck between Galen and Siebert and Dulles and all these people at the end of World War II. Galen says, well, just keep my network in place, let me run it, and you can be in charge of it. So, yeah, I've always maintained that it's Galen that's really running Oswald inside the Soviet Union. And, yeah, he's doing it for the CIA, but Galen being Galen is going to be playing his own game, too.
Which is why it's not easy to detect the pattern that Oswald is using in these operations.
Exactly. And, how do you get Oswald out of the Soviet Union with the daughter of a Soviet GRU colonel, that's their military intelligence, in tow? As his wife, that takes some muscle.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, we didn't have it other than his organization. So let's go back to the Texas Oil Men and Peter Dale Scott making this connection between them and Galen's organization. What's the liaison? And I'll tell you what my suspicion is. My suspicion is that the liaison between the oil men, the White Russian community, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Galen is George de Mohrenschildt. Because George de Mohrenschildt is one of those Russo-Germans. He's from White Russia. He's from Byelorussia, which is where Oswald ends up. And Mohrenschildt, if you look at his behavior after the war, it's clear that he's an intelligence agent for somebody, and everybody thinks he's CIA. And I'm thinking, no, this is Galen. This, he may be ostensibly CIA, but he's reporting directly to General Galen.
Yeah.
And he's in the position, and he, as assassination researchers tell you, he's the one that introduces Oswald to the Texas oil men. He's the one that introduces Oswald to the Dallas White Russian community. He's the one that kind of maneuvers and positions so that Hunt gets him the job at the Texas School Book Depository. So in other words, to me, Daniel, the handprints of the Nazis are all over the JFK assassination. That's why the Hitler file is in the Kennedy stuff. It's not accidental. It's genuine. It's not somebody's joke. And this is the context for why it's there. I think absolutely that this is the unknown aspect of the JFK assassination. And as far as I know, the only other two researchers that picked up on this connection were Mae Brussel, who just shredded the Warren Commission after it came out, and the other one being Jim Garrison.
Right. Yeah.
And those are the only two I think that bumped into this. And in both cases, you can kind of look at their public statements about it. They don't really know what to do about it. And I'm not trying to fault them. It's just that certain things were not well known back then that are much better known now. But yeah, they both came up against this fascist connection. Ruby warned about it, and people thought he was nuts. But yeah, it's there, and it's. I think it's a major part of the assassination, and I think probably this is one aspect that they've wanted to scrub from the files.
No doubt, they've been at it. That is fascinating. In your LBJ JFK book, you pointed out an incredible connection to this, which will lead us again to this Nazi international, the early spacecraft development at NASA, and a labyrinth of what I refer to as X-Tech in my reporting on the X-Steganography series and how it relates to the secrecy program. You pointed out that Oswald is staying in Oak Cliff with his wife and child at the Michael and Ruth Payne residence. as a guest.
Yes.
And that Michael Payne is an engineer at Bell Helicopter working under
General Walter Dornberger.
Yes.
General Oberst Walter Dornberger, mein Führer.
Well, let's talk about Walter Dornberger.
Dornberger. Yeah, there's all of these Nazi connections. Let's look at Oswald before we get to Dornberger.
Okay.
Because Oswald, depending on which one you're talking about, this is like the Hess case. We've got all these Oswald doubles all over the place. Oswald, according to his Marine buddy Nelson Delgado, and Delgado's testimony is right there in the Warren Commission, although, again, it's one of those things that gets overlooked. Delgado heard him not only speaking Russian, but speaking German.
Wow.
And if you look at the way Oswald gets out of this country into the Soviet Union, the initial excuse that Oswald makes is he wants to go to Switzerland to study in some college.
Right.
So, my point here with raising Oswald...
Albert Schweitzer,
that's it. That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Oswald speaking German and Russian would make sense. Why? If Galen's organization is the organization actually running all of this.
He'd have to.
He'd have to speak both Russian and German. Exactly. Bingo. The other thing about Oswald was when they captured his address book, there were a number of very weird things in it for this supposedly Marxist pro-Castro Cuban guy.
Uh-huh.
One of the things was he had the name, address, and phone number of George Lincoln Rockwell, who, of course, at that time was the president of the American Nazi Party.
Right.
So if you're on pick up the phone and able to phone the president of the American Nazi Party, why?
Yeah.
That's the question. There's all these indicators, in other words, just with Oswald alone, again, of this fascist presence in the Kennedy assassination that no one wants to deal with. So
that is remarkable. Yeah.
It is very remarkable, yes. Now, what was the other thing I said we'd get back to?
Dornberger,
yes. Walter Dornberger.
Yeah.
What he's doing in the middle of all of this just kind of boggles the mind because, as you say, Ruth Payne's husband is working for Bell Helicopters, and Walter Dornberger is a major vice president in that organization.
Uh-huh.
So what's a Nazi general doing in Bell Helicopter? Well, interestingly enough, Dornberger was the German army general that was in charge of the rocket ballistic missile program of Werner von Braun and company in Nazi Germany. Von Braun answered directly to Dornberger. Dornberger was his boss, in other words. Dornberger was the fellow that set up this whole rocket ballistic missile secret research program, and he was really, if you get right down to it, the fellow that was the day-to-day manager at Peenemünde, the big rocket research facility there.
Uh-huh.
So how does Dornberger get over to this country? Well, it turns out that our good old American know-how, as exemplified, if I can quote the Tom Lehrer song, in our such good old Americans as Dr. Werner von Braun, it turns out that Dr. von Braun insisted to the Americans after he came over here, insisted that, and he went to the point of saying, we're not going to work for you unless you bring General Dornberger over here, and unless you bring Dr. Hermann Obert, which eventually they bring him over as well. So, in other words, Dornberger's in this country because Werner von Braun and his fellow Nazis told the Americans, we're not going to do a lick of work for you unless you bring our old boss over here.
So von Braun reassembled his team.
Bingo! Bingo, lock, stock, and barrel. and the real nuts and bolts of that is if you study very carefully. Linda Hunt pointed this out in her book about the paperclip Nazis. If you study very carefully, all of these Germans that are building our missiles and launching our satellites and eventually going to put a man on the moon. What these Germans did was they reproduced exactly the chain of command inside of NASA, inside the U.S. Army that they had in Germany. The same structure.
Amazing.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, could we possibly have been more stupid?
Yeah, right. Well, it's real fascinating when you look at this and you think to yourself, the way history paints Oswald is this disgruntled nobody working a minimum wage job who just so happened to get the job 6 weeks before Kennedy showed up and made him a big shot by shooting with a broken rifle in a feat that an ultimate marksman can't do.
Right.
So we know that story is absurd. But then we look at Oswald and we start to see things like when he's staying with the Paynes, and the Paynes are associated with Bell Helicopter, and Michael Payne reports to Dornberger. Then you start to look at Oswald completely differently.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, too, because all of the evidence that convicts Oswald in the public eye comes out of the Payne household.
Yes, exactly. And the other thing that we have to remember here is that all the evidence that points to Oswald having had some sort of intelligence connection, which is there. I mean, like it or not, it's there. I mean, he's got the name of FBI agent James Hosty, in his notebook, and he's one of the special agents in the Dallas office. So there's even evidence that Hoover, as early as Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union, is trailing Oswald.
Right.
Plus, you have, his very obvious connections to the CIA, which most assassination researchers are onto. But what they're missing is that all-important, crucial link to General Galen.
Mm-hmm.
Because, again, that is the CIA's Soviet desk. We don't have one. It's really West German intelligence that's doing all of this for us.
Mm-hmm.
Oswald's associations. Let's boil it down and just put it country simple. This is not a lone nut that is working on his own in some crazed fantasy to shoot the president and go down in history. This is not the profile that he fits.
Right. Yeah, not at all.
Not at all. Mm-mm.
No. As a matter of fact, it's remarkable even that he went to the Soviet Union, which was a very hard thing to do.
Yeah.
In 1959. I mean,
1959.
Doesn't get any harder than that. But here's what's interesting. Dornberger is wanted during that period when von Braun suggests, heavily that he needs him. He's wanted for crimes at the Nuremberg trial.
Yes.
And if they don't take him out of there, he's looking at the gallows.
Yes. And it's important to remember why. When the operation at Peenemünde was largely transferred to underground facilities, the Nordhausen facility in particular, with all of its slave labor making rocket parts, Dornberger is still in charge of all of this. So in other words, there's no way that Dornberger or von Braun or Arthur Rudolph or all these people that we brought over here, one of the most infamous being Hubertus Strugholt, space medicine. Well, Strugholt was able to get his fantastic space medicine results by experimenting on human subjects, concentration camp victims. Dornberger, as you say, was facing, the gallows. And he's brought over very quickly at von Braun's insistence. And this could not have been accomplished without the input and okay of the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany at the time, who turns out to be John J. Mccloy. And this is yet another dark name in the whole Kennedy assassination business that ties to Nazis, because John J. Mccloy was a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, which of course connects him to the Dulles brothers.
Right.
Prior to the war, John J. Mccloy had shared a box with Adolf Hitler at the Berlin Olympics in 1936. Why? Well, it's because John J. Mccloy was the attorney of record for the American branch of I.G. Farben.
Wow.
And where does Mccloy subsequently end up? Well, he ends up as a commissioner on the Warren Commission.
All right.
So in other words, you know, my approach in the JFK book, I think we've mentioned this before, was if you look at all of the people on the Warren Commission, at some point, every single one of them represents one of the interests that have been fingered by JFK assassination researchers as having been involved in the assassination. So that's kind of a nifty way to run a cover-up.
Yeah, right.
Just, you know,
one representative from each.
Yeah, one representative from each faction. Thank you, Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Right. Yeah.
It's just unreal.
That is amazing, though. Mccloy is quite a mover and a shaker.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And he has a lot to do with that post-war Berlin reconstruction. He's deep into that. And the reassignment of all these guys right through Mccloy. What's interesting to think about is Dornberger himself, his rank in Germany. What is his rank?
His rank was Generalmajor, Major General, but it's important to note the differences between German and American ranking systems. A German Major General would be equivalent to a Brigadier General in this country. In other words, it's a one-star general, not a two-star. But he was head of the rocket artillery section of what was called the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Ordnance Bureau. So in other words, he was very powerful in terms of his position with their rocket program, and that would have inevitably meant, given his position throughout the war and even prior to the war in that post, this would have put Dornberger in direct chain of command linkage, firstly to Rudolf Hess, who was Reich Commissar for all technological development matters. In other words, prior to 1941, when Hess flies to Britain, it's Hess that's running all of Nazi Germany's secret research. So in other words, Dornberger would have been probably very well known to Hess. And then, of course, after he flies, when eventually the SS itself takes over all of this secret research, this would have put him probably in almost day-to-day contact with Hans Kammler. So in other words, Dornberger was crucially placed and was a valuable prize for the Germans coming to this country to stay in contact with, because he would have had contact information with other secret projects that were being run in the Third Reich, and he probably would have had some knowledge of them. So he was absolutely crucial.
In terms of that exotic technology angle, because Kammler, from your research, is in charge of the Bell Project.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. And incidentally, Hermann Oberth in my research had something to do with the Bell Project. And who does von Braun want to bring over here in addition to Dornberger? Well, Hermann Oberth. So yeah, there's something going on here that has much deeper technological implications. So getting back to Kennedy, why would the Nazis be involved with the Kennedy assassination? And I think the answer is very simple. When President Kennedy issues that memorandum after the Bay of Pigs that he's going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces, and the crucial thing is turn all of the covert operations over to the Pentagon directly, meaning under JFK's executive control, and take it away from the CIA. What he's just done is he's taken the umbrella, the CIA umbrella behind which the Nazis are operating, away from them. So in other words, they would view this as a direct threat. And the covert operations desk, you know, this is being run by people like Richard Bissell and Frank Wisner, all of these people that are connected at some point to these Nazis. Well, they're being taken out of the picture too. So Kennedy's really destroying the whole chain of command infrastructure that these Nazis are networked with. So, you know, he's not only a threat to the CIA people, he's a threat to these people as well. So, he's
going to rip up their network.
He's going to rip up their network. Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And one of the things I focused on, because I did this interview with Douglas Caddy, who was close with E. Howard Hunt, and E. Howard Hunt told him it was over the UFO file that Kennedy was assassinated. It's interesting because Kennedy issues those memos 10 days before he's assassinated saying, I want to share this information and I want to do a joint moon mission with the Soviets. That's anathema to the Paperclip boys.
It's absolutely anathema to the Paperclip boys, because if any of those UFO files, or as I suspect there was some sort of deal cut between these Nazi scientists and the Americans to share their technology, which I think enabled the Apollo missions. For reasons that we can go into if you want. But when Kennedy is ordering these files to be vetted and then shared, again, this is yet another motivation, because what this is doing is it's threatening, number one, that whole Black Project's infrastructure that had been carefully set up after the war, largely during President Truman's administration. Including, you know, hidden finance systems and all of that stuff that I've been writing about in the books. Well, Kennedy's taking direct aim at all of that too. You know, and if you're somebody like Richard Bissell or some of these Nazis that we brought over here, looking at all of these developments, you're going to be horrified. Because, you know, part of those developments were shooting off rockets, but there's a lot deeper developments than just that going on. And Kennedy, again, is threatening to share all of this, you know, with their mortal enemy, the communists. So,
They just
let the Russians get there on their own, you know.
They just spent 5 years battling those guys.
Exactly.
Tooth and nail for every inch. They almost took over Russia. They were that close. Then Russia beats them back, and their memory is, this is our biggest enemy of all. Exactly.
You know, 2 world wars with Russia. If you're German and you've got a shred of you know, German patriotism, you're going to look at this whole development quite askance. So in other words, you've got a bunch of pissed off people in the American deep state, within the American intelligence community, you know, both Americans and Germans, that are looking at all of this. And then you throw the mafia into the mix, you throw the Cubans into the mix. You have basically targeted everybody in one fell swoop in the American deep state. So yeah, Kennedy made a lot of enemies. And I kind of am of the opinion, Daniel, that when Kennedy is doing all of this, he may know to a certain extent what he's doing, but I don't think he had any idea of the vast interconnected relationships between all these factions in the American deep state. I think he probably dramatically underestimated that.
Yes. He probably thought that he was immune to a certain degree.
Yes, exactly.
That he could make these kinds of changes. And he looked at the system and said, you know, this is really the part that's wrong, which is the CIA is in charge of this stuff. And we know from deep aides like Arthur Schlesinger and all this stuff that he would always say, those CIA bastards, I've got to get my hands on their projects. We have to get a handle on this. So we know for a fact that he's after all of their kind of invisible government and what they're doing all over the world.
Yes.
What I think of when I'm looking at JFK and his actions there, getting close to that exotic technology, by saying we're going to share these cases.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to share the UFO file with the Soviets.
Mm-hmm.
What is the thing that's always struck me about it is what's going on in his mind there to say I'm going to share this information with them? Is he thinking, that this is a crucial step for peace?
Yeah, I think he's thinking that partially. But the other thing I think that he might be thinking, and again, we're trying to reverse engineer his thought processes, which is risky.
Yes.
I think Kennedy was probably aware enough of the UFO problem and all of its interconnections with deep state politics, simply because, number one, he is coming into office certainly kind of as a maverick, but certainly not as an uninformed maverick. He would probably have been in personal contact with President Truman and learned some of President Truman's misgivings about what he had set up.
Uh-huh.
Then, of course, you have President Eisenhower and the peculiar way that he left office, which if you stop and think about it, to say what President Eisenhower said on leaving and to demand national airtime on the 3 networks, to say it.
Right.
That's mighty peculiar if you stop and think about it. All this warning about the military-industrial complex. And I think it's because Eisenhower knew, number one, he had been played with the U-2 business. I think he began to realize that he had been played about, nuclear retaliation against the Soviet Union when he finally saw the plan, which he was horrified at what the plan was. I think when Kennedy meets Eisenhower after his election and it begins to be debriefed, I'm quite certain, although there's again no evidence, that Eisenhower may have pulled him aside for a heart-to-heart and said, here's what I've found out, and this is not going to show up in any of your briefings. Watch your step, my boy, because it's very interesting. After the assassination, the press cornered President Eisenhower. I remember this very vividly. You can watch this statement on a documentary called Evidence of Revision. The press asks Eisenhower, what does he think about the assassination? And Eisenhower's response is really, really peculiar, because you can see him bristle. You can see him tense physically on the screen. And this is not a guy accustomed to doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, he kind of repeats himself. Well, one thing I'm confident about, and listen to his words, the American people will not be stampeded. And he says this at least twice.
Wow.
And again, I'm taking that as kind of a warning. Beware of any explanations about all of this. Don't be stampeded. It's like he's anticipating, that they're going to concoct a nutty story. So Kennedy, I'm thinking Kennedy is coming into all of this without any illusions, in a certain sense, about the basic problem is that we've got a deep state that's beginning to get out of control. Because Truman's warning about it, his predecessor's warning about it. He's just run against Eisenhower's vice president, who's up to his earlobes with involvement with it.
Mm-hmm.
Nixon is on the planning committee for the Bay of Pigs.
Right.
For crying out loud. I don't think he's under any illusions about the nature of this. You've got, in addition to that, you've got his and his brother's connections to Senator McCarthy and all those investigations that he was familiar with and supportive of. So he's looking at all of this deep state problem. And I think, yes, if there was a mistake he made here, Daniel, it was probably with this UFO business, because what he didn't realize, he wasn't drawing connections. What he didn't realize was that by saying we're going to share this info with the Soviets, that he was threatening a long-term, deeply black research project that had been set up quite literally in the Truman years, probably without Truman's direct knowledge of it. I think this plays into the picture big time in all of this.
I absolutely can see it. And we're looking at this X technology question again, and that's as black as a black project can go.
Right.
What was it that Stansfield Turner, Jimmy Carter's CIA director, said? It's black, black, black.
Exactly.
Now, Joseph, before we end part one here, and this has just been amazing, we're going to focus on Jim Garrison and the aerospace aspect of this in part two. Can you give us just a preview of how he ran into the same thing?
One of the things the Garrison investigation uncovers, which is kind of summarized in a little known, little referred to document about the assassination called the Torbett document, is precisely this connection between the deep intelligence, between the paperclip Germans and deeply black space research projects. And it's all being coordinated by Werner von Braun.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Which means Dornberger, Arthur Rudolph, and this whole nest of Nazis that we brought over here.
Right.
I think Garrison, when he's uncovering all of this, which I can just kind of see the mystification on his face. We've got David Ferry, Mary Sherman, Alton Ochsner, Lee Oswald wanting to get a job at the Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans because a lot of people go on to get jobs at NASA from this coffee company. And you have Oswald boasting in New Orleans that, hey, I'm going to get a job with NASA.
Yeah. Instant aerospace connections.
Yeah, instant aerospace connection. Well, you've got all of this going on, and Garrison, I honestly think, didn't know what to make of it because none of this makes its way into the trial of Clay Shaw, or very little of it makes its way into the trial of Clay Shaw. But it's there in his research files.
Yes, and Garrison told the editor of Ramparts magazine how strange that all was, and how he had realized the assassination was not just Texas oil millionaires. It was actually developed by some black ops in the aerospace companies.
Right.
Quite a realization. Now, it's no accident that among the files the CIA blocked in the records release of the JFK assassination are the 800 pages of their interference in DA Jim Garrison's investigation. Now, we'll pick all of this up in part 2, and subscribers will get the special episode in their inbox next week. If you're not yet a subscriber, now's the time. Go to darkjournalist.com, and we'll keep last year's discount there for everyone until January 31st. Of course, we'll also be back next Friday, January 25th at 7 p.m. for part 44 of the X series that tracks the X-Tech as it moves secretly through various government agencies. Of course, everyone can find your exciting work at GizaDeathStar.com.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Joseph, stay right there, and onward to part 2. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you for joining me for this special Part 1 episode on the Secret Space Program with Dr. Joseph Farrell. You can find more special reports, interviews, and documentaries by going to www.darkjournalist.com. You can also subscribe here to our YouTube channel to receive the latest videos. See you soon.